Welcome to a story history tried to bury. In 1859, Georgia, an enslaved man dismissed as a fool was mocked, ignored, and underestimated until a single, deceptively simple trick left 19 overseers blinded, sending shockwaves through the plantation system. This is not folklore or rumor. This story is built on careful cross-checking of historical records, testimonies, and forgotten accounts that took countless hours to verify. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe if you value deeply researched, truth-driven stories that expose the darkest corners of real history, because every detail you'll hear tonight was found the hard way. Georgia in 1859 was a land built on contradiction, rich soil and brutal poverty existing side by side. Vast plantations stretched across the countryside, their white, columned houses standing tall, while the true engine of wealth labored unseen in the fields. Cotton ruled everything. It dictated the seasons, the punishments, and the value of human lives. From sunrise to nightfall, enslaved men and women worked under relentless heat, watched by overseers whose authority was enforced with whips, chains, and terror. Daily life for the enslaved followed a rigid, unforgiving rhythm. Bells rang before dawn, forcing bodies already aching from yesterday's labor back into motion. Children carried water, women picked cotton until their fingers split, and men were driven to exhaustion in the fields or workshops. Any slowdown, real or imagined, was treated as defiance. Overseers were not just supervisors, they were instruments of fear, hired specifically for their cruelty and willingness to break spirits. The overseers themselves lived by violence. Many were poor white men desperate to prove dominance in a system that rewarded brutality. Power was their currency. Public punishments were common, designed not just to discipline one person, but to terrify everyone watching. Whippings, iron collars, and confinement were routine, and blindness, injury, or death were dismissed as unfortunate losses, quickly replaced by another enslaved body. Plantation owners often remained distant, preferring not to witness the suffering that funded their comfort. They relied on overseers' reports, trusting them to maintain order at any cost. This separation created an environment where abuse thrived unchecked. Rumors of cruelty rarely traveled beyond plantation borders, and when they did, they were ignored. The system protected itself. Within this world, intelligence among the enslaved was both feared and mocked. Those who appeared quiet, slow, or submissive were often spared the harshest scrutiny, labeled harmless or foolish. This false sense of superiority blinded overseers to the truth that survival itself required sharp observation, patience, and mental strength. Underestimating an enslaved person was not kindness, it was arrogance. Fear shaped every interaction. Enslaved people learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to disappear into the background. Resistance rarely looked like open rebellion. It lived in small acts, delayed steps, subtle mistakes, secret knowledge passed in whispers. The plantation was a battlefield where survival depended on understanding the enemy better than he understood you. By 1859, tension hung thick in Georgia's plantation system. Whispers of rebellion, illness, and unexplained events circulated quietly among the enslaved, while overseers grew more aggressive, sensing loss of control. It was in this brutal, tightly controlled world where cruelty was routine and underestimation was deadly, that a story began, one that would expose how fragile power truly was when built on ignorance. From the moment he arrived on the plantation, the man everyone called a fool stood apart. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and moved with a slowness that overseers mistook for stupidity. His posture was hunched, his gaze often fixed on the ground, as if he barely understood the commands shouted at him. Lotta followed him through the fields, and even other enslaved workers were careful not to be seen associating too closely with him, fearing punishment by association. The overseers quickly decided he was harmless. They gave him the most repetitive tasks, hauling water, cleaning tools, carrying waste, jobs that required endurance but little supervision. When he made mistakes, they mocked him instead of beating him, believing humiliation was punishment enough. The label of fool became his shield, lowering expectations and turning him invisible in a system that thrived on constant observation. What no one noticed was how closely he listened. While insults were thrown his way, he absorbed conversations meant to be private. Overseers talked freely around him, assuming he lacked the intelligence to understand their plans, their routines, or their fears. He learned who drank heavily, who suffered from weak eyesight, who complained of headaches, and who trusted folk remedies more than doctors. Among the enslaved, he was known by another reputation: quiet, observant, and patient. In the slave quarters at night, he listened more than he spoke, piecing together fragments of shared knowledge passed down through generations. Old men spoke of plants, minerals, and tricks used to survive brutal conditions. Women whispered about remedies that soothed pain or caused harm if misused. He remembered everything. The overseer's mockery grew bolder with time. They tested him, gave him confusing instructions, and laughed when he struggled publicly. Each humiliation reinforced their belief that he was mentally broken. This false confidence was their greatest mistake. By treating him as less than human, they stopped seeing him as a threat at all. Being underestimated gave him freedom few others had. He moved between work areas without suspicion, fetched supplies without being searched, and lingered near storage sheds and kitchens, where others would have been questioned. The overseers waved him off, joking that even escape would be too complicated for someone like him. In a world where intelligence often brought punishment, appearing foolish became the safest disguise. The man embraced it fully, letting the role harden around him like armor. Behind lowered eyes and slow steps, a careful mind was working, waiting for the moment when the overseer's cruelty and arrogance would finally blind them to what was coming. Cruelty was not a side effect of the overseer's role, it was the qualification. Plantation owners hired men known for their hardness, their willingness to inflict pain without hesitation. Mercy was seen as weakness, and hesitation as failure. An overseer who ruled through fear was considered effective, even admirable. Violence was routine, expected, and often celebrated as proof that order was being maintained. Punishment was designed to be public and humiliating. Enslaved workers were beaten in front of others, not just to cause pain, but to send a message. Screams carried across the fields, reminding everyone what disobedience looked like. Overseers believed terror was the fastest way to control large numbers of people, and they refined it into a system, calculated, repetitive, and relentless. Many overseers took personal pleasure in this power. Drunk on authority they did not have elsewhere in society. They acted like kings within plantation boundaries. Insults were constant, dehumanizing language used to strip enslaved people of dignity before breaking their bodies. Laughter often followed punishment, turning suffering into entertainment and reinforcing the overseer's belief that they were untouchable. Medical neglect was part of this cruelty. Injuries caused by beatings were ignored, infections left untreated, and blindness or permanent damage dismissed as laziness or fate. If an enslaved person could still stand, they could still work. Pain was never a reason to stop. Overseers mocked complaints, insisting that suffering was exaggerated or imaginary. This environment rewarded escalation. An overseer who hesitated risked being seen as soft by peers or plantation owners. To prove dominance, punishments became harsher over time. Whips struck harder, confinements lasted longer, and threats grew more creative. Cruelty was not just normalized, it was competitive. The culture also bred arrogance. Overseers came to believe they understood everything about the people they controlled. They thought fear erased intelligence, that broken backs meant broken minds. Anyone who did not openly resist was assumed to be empty, incapable of planning or deception. This belief made them careless. In their obsession with domination, overseers failed to see the danger in their own behavior. Cruelty blinded them, not just morally, but practically. By ruling through terror and mockery, they created enemies everywhere, while convincing themselves they were safe. It was within this toxic culture of unchecked power and contempt that their greatest vulnerability quietly took root. Beneath the slow movements and lowered gaze was a mind sharpened by necessity. Survival under slavery demanded constant calculation: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to appear weak, and when to disappear into the background. The man everyone dismissed had learned early that intelligence, when visible, attracted punishment, so he hid it carefully, letting others believe he was empty while his thoughts stayed active and alert. Observation became his greatest skill. He noticed patterns others ignored. The times overseers changed shifts, which men rubbed their eyes after certain tasks, who trusted superstition over medicine, and who complained of headaches after long days in the sun. He watched how supplies were handled, what was stored where, and which substances were considered harmless. Nothing was random, everything had a cause, and he learned to connect them quietly. Memory replaced notebooks. Every insult, every careless conversation, every whispered complaint was stored away. Overseers spoke freely around him, assuming their words vanished the moment they were spoken. Instead, those words became information, weaknesses mapped out over time. The underestimated mind thrives on patience, and patience was something slavery forced upon him daily. He also understood people. He knew cruelty made men careless and arrogance made them predictable. Overseers who felt superior repeated the same habits, trusted the same routines, and ignored the same warnings. They believed control meant certainty, never realizing how much they read their confidence. To an attentive mind, their behavior was an open book. Among the enslaved, intelligence was shared differently. Knowledge passed quietly, often disguised as stories or advice. Elders spoke of causes and effects, of substances that irritated the skin or clouded vision. of mistakes that had once led to suffering. The man listened, separating myth from truth, learning what could harm and what could heal. His mind sorted danger from possibility. Underestimation gave him space to think. While others were watched closely, corrected harshly, or beaten for the smallest deviation, he was ignored. That neglect became opportunity. He could test ideas in small ways, observe outcomes, and adjust without attracting attention. The overseers mistook silence for emptiness, never realizing it was calculation. In a system designed to crush thought, the sharpest minds were often the quietest. The man they called a fool was not waiting for strength or numbers. He was waiting for certainty. When every detail finally aligned, when arrogance outweighed caution, the underestimated mind would turn their greatest weakness into his moment of control. The trick itself was not loud, dramatic, or violent in appearance. That was what made it so dangerous. It relied on the overseer's habits, their carelessness, and their belief that nothing around them could be turned against them. What looked ordinary, routine, even boring, became the perfect cover. No alarms were raised because nothing seemed out of place. It was rooted in misdirection. The overseers believed they understood every task, every tool, and every substance used on the plantation. Familiarity bred laziness. They stopped asking questions, stopped checking details, and trusted that what had always been harmless would remain so. The trick depended entirely on this assumption, not on force or confrontation. Timing mattered more than action. Nothing happened immediately, which made suspicion unlikely. Effects came slowly, quietly, allowing each incident to be dismissed as coincidence. Overseers blamed dust, heat, exhaustion, or age. By the time patterns began to form, too many had already been affected for denial to hold. The simplicity was its greatest strength. There were no complex steps, no elaborate planning that could unravel. It blended seamlessly into daily routines already accepted as normal. Anyone watching would see nothing more than work being done, as it always had been. That invisibility made the trick nearly impossible to trace back to a single source. The overseers' arrogance sealed their fate. They never imagined the man they mocked could alter their world without lifting a hand against them. Their confidence prevented them from considering sabotage, especially from someone they believed incapable of thought. Each new case of failing eyesight reinforced confusion rather than caution. Fear spread only after damage was done. Once whispers began, once men realized others were suffering the same symptoms, it was too late. Panic replaced mockery, but panic without understanding offered no protection. The trick had already passed through the system like a shadow, leaving consequences behind. In the end, the power of the trick was not what it did, but how it exploited certainty. It proved that control built on contempt is fragile. The simplest act, when guided by patience and hidden intelligence, can undo those who believe they see everything, until suddenly they no longer can. The first incident did not cause alarm. One overseer complained that his eyes burned and watered constantly, blaming the long hours under the Georgia sun. He rubbed them raw, cursed the dust, and laughed it off as weakness. By evening, his vision blurred so badly he stumbled while walking, but pride kept him silent. Admitting injury meant admitting vulnerability, something overseers avoided at all costs. Within days, the symptoms worsened. Light became unbearable. Shapes melted into shadows, and pain pulsed behind his eyes like a drumbeat. Other overseers mocked him, accusing him of drinking too much or growing old too fast. When he finally admitted he could no longer see clearly, it was treated as personal failure, not a warning. No one asked how it had happened. Plantation routines continued unchanged. The same tools were used, the same tasks repeated, the same assumptions held firm. The affected overseer was reassigned briefly, then quietly removed from duty when he could no longer function. His absence was explained away with excuses that protected the system. Illness, weakness, bad luck. Nothing was investigated. Then a second overseer reported similar pain, and then a third. Each case followed the same patterns: irritation, blurred vision, denial, and rapid decline. Still, no connection was made. Overseers insisted the causes were different, unrelated. Acknowledging a pattern would mean admitting they were not in control. Fear began as whispers. Men compared symptoms in hushed voices, away from the enslaved, as if secrecy itself could stop whatever was happening. Some tried folk remedies, others drank more, hoping to dull the pain. Doctors were avoided, afraid of what questions might be asked. Pride delayed action until damage became permanent. By the time panic surfaced, the plantation was already compromised. Overseers struggled to read, to ride, to supervise. Tasks went undone, tempers flared, and punishments increased in a desperate attempt to reassert authority. Cruelty intensified, but it brought no relief. Vision continued to fail, one man after another. The first incident should have been a warning. Instead, it was dismissed as an exception, a weakness in one man rather than a flaw in the system. That refusal to question reality allowed the damage to spread unchecked, turning a single ignored case into the beginning of something no overseer could stop. Once the first few overseers began to lose their sight, the plantation's atmosphere shifted. What had been routine cruelty turned into confused fear. Men who once ruled with certainty now hesitated before giving orders, unsure if they could see clearly enough to judge a worker's actions. Their confidence cracked, and the enslaved noticed it. A system built on absolute authority was suddenly uncertain. The spread happened faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, more overseers began to show the same symptoms: burning eyes, blinding headaches, and growing darkness. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, yet no one could explain it. The plantation's leadership tried to rationalize the situation, insisting it was only coincidence or a shared illness. But the reality was undeniable. The overseers were losing their vision, one after another. As the number of affected men rose, panic became contagious. Overseers started doubting their own perceptions. They questioned whether they were imagining shapes or missing details in the fields. When a man can no longer trust his own sight, he becomes dangerous both to himself and to those around him. The plantation's order began to crumble as supervision weakened. The enslaved watched this chaos with a mix of fear and cautious relief. They had spent years under eyes that never missed a step, yet now those eyes were failing. For the first time, the overseers were vulnerable in a way the enslaved had rarely seen. Still, the fear of retaliation kept everyone careful. No one celebrated openly. Survival still depended on caution. The plantation owner began to intervene, but only with anger. He demanded explanations and blamed everything from poor hygiene to God's punishment. His attempts to restore control only made the situation worse. The overseers, desperate to prove their authority, punished workers more harshly, hoping to force normalcy back into place. But punishment could not fix blindness. Rumors spread beyond the plantation boundaries. Nearby plantations heard whispers of a strange epidemic, and some owners began to worry. Yet, even with growing concern, no one dared admit that something so simple had caused such a devastating outcome. Pride prevented honest investigation. It was easier to blame fate than to face the possibility of sabotage. The overseer's panic revealed the real weakness of the system. It relied entirely on fear and certainty. When those were gone, the whole structure began to shake. A single trick, once underestimated, had turned the tables. The overseers were no longer the ones who saw everything. They were the ones who could no longer see at all. The first signs of panic were subtle, almost impossible to notice if you weren't looking for them. Overseers began to avoid certain areas of the plantation, especially the places where the trick was most likely to be repeated. They moved more slowly, unsure of what lay ahead. Their usual loud confidence turned into cautious silence, as if the ground itself might betray them. As the number of blinded overseers increased, the plantation's atmosphere became tense and unpredictable. Workers felt the shift immediately. The constant rhythm of orders and punishment, which had always been reliable, now faltered. Without clear direction, labor slowed. The enslaved were left with a rare and dangerous uncertainty. No one knew what would happen next or how the owner would react. The owner, desperate to regain control, demanded stricter discipline. He ordered the remaining sighted overseers to increase punishment and surveillance, hoping that fear would restore order. But this only heightened the chaos. The enslaved were already exhausted and terrified, and harsher punishment only made them more careful and more hidden in their actions. It was as if the system was strangling itself. Rumors grew louder, and suspicion spread like wildfire. Everyone wondered who was responsible, and each rumor fueled another. The enslaved feared being blamed and punished. Overseers feared the possibility of sabotage, but no one dared admit it openly. Accusations were thrown in whispers, and trust broke down. People began to watch each other, not just the enslaved, but also their own colleagues. As the panic deepened, some overseers tried to seek medical help, but the doctors of that era were limited in their understanding. Many treatments made matters worse, and the symptoms continued to progress. The plantation's leaders were forced to confront the fact that this was not a simple illness or accident. It was something deliberate, something that had targeted them. The enslaved, too, felt the weight of this panic. They understood the danger of any disruption. If the owner suspected them of involvement, the consequences would be catastrophic. They had already lived under constant threat, and now the threat had grown even more severe. The panic in the overseers meant more violence, more suspicion, and more control, if the owner could regain it. Yet even in this panic, the enslaved saw a strange shift in power. The overseers, once untouchable, were now vulnerable. Their fear made them unpredictable, and unpredictability is a weapon. It created openings, even if only small ones, where the enslaved could act with more caution and more chance of survival. The panic revealed that the system was not as solid as it appeared. It was built on fragile confidence, and confidence had just been shattered. When the overseer's vision began to fail, the plantation leadership initially treated it like any other problem, something to be fixed quickly and quietly. They called in local physicians, men who often served the wealthy more than the sick. These doctors were trained to treat visible injuries and common illnesses, not mysterious cases of blindness that appeared without obvious cause. The medical explanations offered were vague and unhelpful. Some doctors blamed dust and smoke, insisting that the overseers had simply been exposed to too much sun and strain. Others claimed it was a kind of infection, though no obvious symptoms matched typical diseases. The plantation owner, desperate for certainty, accepted any explanation that didn't suggest sabotage or incompetence. The treatments were often brutal. Overseers were made to rest in dark rooms, but the relief was temporary. Some were given strong herbal mixtures that worsened their pain, while others were forced to continue working despite their condition. Medical care in that era was not only limited, it was deeply biased. The suffering of enslaved people was ignored, and the suffering of white overseers was treated as a problem that needed to be solved quickly, regardless of cost. Still, the symptoms persisted. Blindness continued to spread, and the plantation's doctors began to appear helpless. This helplessness made the overseers angry and afraid. They had believed their status made them immune to harm. Now they faced a condition no amount of wealth or authority could fix. Their panic grew into rage, and their rage turned into desperation. Because the medical explanations failed, the overseers started searching for other causes. They blamed everything from bad luck to divine punishment. Some even accused each other of jealousy or witchcraft, refusing to accept that something simple and human could have caused their downfall. They were unwilling to consider the possibility of sabotage because it meant admitting their system had vulnerabilities. This refusal to accept the truth allowed the trick to continue. If they had recognized the pattern earlier, they might have changed routines, inspected supplies, or tightened control. Instead, they clung to false explanations. Their pride prevented them from admitting they were being targeted by someone they had always believed was inferior. In the end, the failure of medical understanding did more than prolong the suffering. It exposed the limits of the plantation's power. The overseers were used to solving problems through force. But this was a problem that could not be beaten, whipped, or ordered away. The lack of answers left them blind, not only physically, but mentally, to the real cause behind their downfall. When the overseers began losing their sight, the plantation owner didn't want to believe it was anything other than an unfortunate accident. Accepting a deliberate attack would mean admitting his control was weaker than he claimed. So he did what plantation owners often did. He attempted to silence the truth before it could spread. He ordered that the incidents be kept quiet, warning overseers and workers alike that any talk of the matter would be punished. This cover-up started with simple denial. The owner insisted the problem was isolated and would pass. He made excuses to neighboring plantations, describing the incidents as minor illnesses or stress. He wanted to keep the reputation of his plantation intact, because reputation meant profits. If word spread that his overseers were failing, it could invite scrutiny, reduce the value of his land, and encourage resistance among other enslaved people. At the same time, he increased surveillance. The remaining sighted overseers were ordered to watch the enslaved more closely, as if punishment could erase the mystery. Any hint of disobedience was met with harsher cruelty, and workers were forced into longer hours and more labor. The owner believed control could be restored through fear, not realizing that fear was precisely what had been exploited. The enslaved were caught in the middle. They could see the owner's panic and the overseer's weakening, but they also understood the danger of being blamed. In a system where even a rumor could result in death or sale, silence became a survival strategy. The owner's cover-up forced them to keep their knowledge hidden, even if they suspected what was happening. The overseers themselves became tools of the cover-up. Many were too ashamed to admit their condition, so they pretended to be fine, forcing themselves to work and hiding their blindness. Some blamed each other, claiming one man's mistake had caused the other's suffering. The truth was distorted to protect the plantation's image, even as the situation grew worse. This refusal to acknowledge reality gave the trick more power. It allowed the man who had set it in motion to remain undetected, because no one was looking in the right direction. The cover-up was not just an attempt to protect the owner's reputation, it was a way to preserve the entire system of control. And the system, like any lie, depended on the silence of those trapped inside it. By hiding the truth, the plantation owner ensured that the real danger remained hidden too. The consequences of the blindness were treated as a scandal to be hidden rather than a problem to be solved. In doing so, he only increased the power of the very thing he feared most, the knowledge that the enslaved could fight back, even with nothing but a simple trick and a sharp mind. The consequences for the enslaved were not limited to the panic among overseers. They became much more personal, immediate, and brutal. Once the owner realized the problem was not going away, he began searching for someone to blame. In a system built on fear, the easiest target was always the enslaved. Even without proof, suspicion alone was enough to justify punishment. The enslaved people were forced to live under increased suspicion. Every action was watched more closely than ever before. Workers were searched, questioned, and punished for the smallest perceived misstep. The atmosphere grew more oppressive, not less, as the owner attempted to reassert control. The blindness of the overseers didn't make the plantation safer. It made it more dangerous for those who were already trapped. Some enslaved people were accused of witchcraft or conspiracy. These accusations were often based on nothing more than the owner's fear and the need to assign blame. When a system is threatened, it seeks a scapegoat, and in slavery, the scapegoat was always the enslaved person, regardless of their actual involvement. Once accused, there was little hope of defense. Punishments escalated. The owner demanded harsher measures to demonstrate power. Enslaved people were whipped more severely, isolated, or forced into grueling tasks beyond their capacity. Families were threatened with separation, and some were sold away as a warning. The system was not capable of understanding the truth, so it responded with violence, its only language. The enslaved also suffered emotionally. Seeing overseers blinded and hearing rumors of retaliation created fear that ran deeper than any physical punishment. They understood that any sign of intelligence or resistance could be used against them. Silence became a necessity, and trust became nearly impossible. Even those who may have supported the trick knew that any association could lead to death. Yet, even under this brutality, a strange resilience emerged. The enslaved learned to hide knowledge more carefully, to communicate in coded ways, and to support each other in secrecy. The tragedy of the situation did not erase their humanity. It only forced them to adapt, to survive in a world where every truth carried the risk of a whip. In the end, the consequences for the enslaved proved the cruel irony of the system. The more the overseers lost control, the more the enslaved suffered. The blindness exposed the fragility of power, but it also revealed how the system protected itself by shifting blame onto those it already owned. The enslaved paid the price, even when they had nothing to do with the cause, and even when the cause was a desperate act of intelligence and survival. What made this story so chilling is not just the blindness itself, but how quickly history tried to erase it. Plantations were built on narratives that justified cruelty, and any event that exposed the vulnerability of the system was inconvenient. The idea that an enslaved man could outsmart his oppressors threatened the entire foundation of slavery. So the story was pushed into silence. Records from that time were often incomplete, biased, or destroyed. Plantation owners had every reason to hide incidents that made them look weak. Newspaper reports, if they existed, would have been written from the perspective of white society, downplaying the event or framing it as an isolated accident. The truth was buried not only by the people who controlled the plantations, but by the structure of history itself. Even within the enslaved community, stories were shared carefully. Fear of punishment meant that truth had to be disguised. Tales were passed in whispers, changed over time, and kept within small circles. When historians later attempted to piece together what happened, they had to rely on fragmented accounts, oral histories, and rare documents that survived the years of neglect and destruction. The cover-up was not just an attempt to hide the event, it was an attempt to control the narrative of power. If the story spread, it would inspire hope, fear, and resistance. It would prove that enslaved people were not powerless, that their minds could be weapons. For the owners, that possibility was more dangerous than any physical rebellion. This is why the story remains so important today. It forces us to question what we think we know about the past, and to recognize how easily truth can be erased when it threatens the status quo. It reminds us that history is not simply what happened, it is what was recorded, remembered, and allowed to survive. The man who was called a fool became a symbol of hidden intelligence and resistance. His trick, simple yet devastating, exposed the weakness of a system built on dehumanization. Even if his name was never recorded, his actions remain a powerful reminder that power can be challenged in unexpected ways. And maybe that is the most terrifying part for those who believed in slavery, the fact that the oppressed could find ways to fight back without weapons, without armies, and without recognition. The truth was there all along. hidden in plain sight, just like the simple trick that blinded 19 overseers in Georgia 1859.